What if the taxi you stepped into by mistake was being driven by a billionaire hiding from his own life? And what if that one wrong ride became the only thing that ever felt right? Helen Brooks was 48, invisible to the world, and exhausted by rejection. Once a literature teacher, now just another resume in a stack no one reads. She wasn't looking for a miracle only a way home from another failed interview, but the man behind the wheel wasn't a cab driver. He was Tom Radcliffe, a man with $1 billion name and a past he wasn't ready to explain. What begins as a rainy day mistake turns into something deeper, unexpected comfort, slow-burning conversation, and a connection that defies logic. But when secrets unravel, Helen must confront the question that haunts so many of us. Can you trust someone who didn't tell you the truth if they were the only person who ever truly saw you? Is love still real if it began with a lie? If you've ever longed to be seen for who you are, not what the world says you should be like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories, because the best stories often start with a wrong turn. Now let's begin. Helen Brooks was not a woman who took up space in a room. She had learned, over the course of nearly 5 decades, how to shrink herself without anyone asking. Her presence was quiet but kind, like a worn book on a shelf overlooked by many, but deeply cherished by those who took the time to open it. At 48, Helen found herself starting over again, not in the romantic, liberating way the magazines often described it, but in the kind that left your stomach hollow and your hands trembling as you sent out another resume into the void. She had once been a literature teacher good at it, by most accounts. Her students loved her metaphors, her soft voice, her ability to make even the most restless teenager pause at the weight of a poem. But that was before budget cuts claimed her position, before her mother's long illness devoured her savings, before her quiet world fell silent. That Thursday morning felt no different than the others, gray, tired, and reluctant to begin. Helen buttoned her navy coat with mechanical precision and headed downtown for yet another job interview. She didn't expect much. The world had changed. People wanted faster, louder, younger, and Helen was none of those things. Still, she tried. She sat in the lobby of the sleek, glass-paneled office tower, with her resume neatly clipped and her questions rehearsed. The HR manager, a woman who looked younger than Helen's favorite sweater, smiled politely, but didn't ask many questions. "We're really looking for someone with more digital agility," she had said, as if Helen were a rotary phone in an iPhone world. Helen nodded, thanked her for her time, and stepped out onto the cold sidewalk, the weight of unspoken rejection heavy on her shoulders. It wasn't the first door that had closed. It wouldn't be the last. The sky had begun to weep light rain, just enough to smear her glasses and dampen her spirit. She walked toward the curb and raised her hand for a cab. One pulled up almost instantly. She didn't notice it wasn't yellow. She didn't care. She slid into the back seat, grateful to be out of the cold. "Where to?" The voice was low, calm, a man's voice, older, gentle in its delivery. "West 72nd and Harper," she replied, brushing a strand of graying hair from her forehead. The car moved smoothly through the drizzle. Helen stared out the window, watching the raindrops slide down in unpredictable paths like the course of her life. Rough day. It wasn't the words that startled her, but the tone. No condescension, no pity, just curiosity. Human curiosity. Helen hesitated, then surprised herself by answering. Another interview, another polite rejection, a pause. Then the driver said, "They don't see what they're missing." Helen turned her gaze toward the rearview mirror. She caught his eyes, clear, unhurried, kind. She gave a small, dry laugh. Or maybe they see exactly what I am, which is someone past her prime, out of place in a world that speaks in hashtags and algorithms. The driver didn't respond immediately. Then, sometimes the world forgets the value of what can't be optimized. That silenced her, but in a good way. For the rest of the ride, they said little. It was a silence she didn't mind. It wasn't awkward. It was shared space, like the quiet between verses in a song. When they arrived at her apartment building, she reached into her bag for her wallet. "How much?" The driver shook his head. "No charge." Helen blinked. "Excuse me, consider it a favor, from someone who still believes in dignity." She frowned. "I can't accept charity. It's not charity," he said simply. "It's hope." He smiled, just barely, and looked back to the road. Helen stepped out into the soft rain. She wanted to ask his name, but the door had already closed, and the car rolled away, disappearing into the mist of Hopeville's afternoon. She stood there for a long moment, unsure why her heart felt a little heavier and a little lighter all at once. The rain hadn't let up by morning. It was the sort of steady drizzle that seemed to wash away the boundaries of time. No sunrise, no shadows, just gray that seeped into everything. Hopeville was quiet under the weather's weight. The streets were slick, reflections of traffic lights shimmering on the asphalt like restless memories. Helen Brooks stood in the corner bakery, fingers wrapped around a warm paper cup, even though the tea inside had long gone cold. She wasn't ready to go back home. Not yet. The apartment was too quiet, and her thoughts too loud. She glanced through the fogged-up window. People passed with umbrellas angled like shields. She wondered if any of them felt like her stalled in the middle of life, not sure whether they were supposed to turn back or press on. With a resigned breath, she pushed open the bakery door and stepped outside. She hadn't planned to take a cab again. Her budget didn't allow indulgences, but the ache in her knees said otherwise. She raised her hand at the curb. This time, she paid attention. A black sedan, not yellow, slid up to the sidewalk. Her breath caught. The driver lowered the window. It was him. The same calm eyes, the same soft voice. "Need a ride for a moment." Helen hesitated. What were the chances a coincidence or something more deliberate? But then again, what did it matter? "Yes," she said, opening the door. "Same destination." He nodded and pulled away from the curb. The car's interior smelled faintly of sandalwood and old leather, the kind of scent that comforted without trying too hard. The silence between them stretched, but not uncomfortably. "You don't talk much," Helen said, almost to herself. "Neither do you," he answered, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. She allowed herself a small smile. Fair point. They drove in silence for a few minutes before she asked, "So, what's your story? You don't strike me as someone who drives a car for a living." He didn't answer right away. "Then I used to build things, bridges, mostly. Spent years studying stress loads, tension points, wind patterns, and now I just carry people over different kinds of bridges." Helen blinked. "That sounds poetic." He shrugged, but not dismissively. "There's something about driving. You see people in their in-between moments heading to interviews, coming from funerals, running from mistakes. No one wears a mask in the backseat of a car." She leaned her head back. The rhythm of the windshield wipers, the steady hum of tires on wet pavement, it lulled her into a kind of honesty. "I used to be a teacher, literature, for 23 years. What happened? Budget cuts, downsizing, a new principal who thought poetry was a waste of time. A pause. And what do you think?" She looked at him. "I think words are what hold us together. Without them, everything unravels." He nodded slowly. "Then maybe you taught the most important subject." Helen looked away. No one had said that to her before. Not like that. Not with so much conviction. They passed through an old part of town, where buildings bore faded paint and tired signs. She watched a child jump across puddles with reckless joy and remembered a student named Emma who used to do the same. Emma had once left a note on Helen's desk that said, "You made me feel seen." That was years ago, but it suddenly came back now, clear as rain on glass. "You always drive this route?" she asked. "Only on Thursdays." Helen furrowed her brow. "But yesterday was Thursday. I added an extra shift," he said without looking at her. She didn't press. Something in his tone suggested she shouldn't. But her heart nudged her anyway. This wasn't just a job for him. There was a reason he was here, a reason he noticed her. When they arrived at her building, Helen reached into her coat pocket. "Don't tell me," she said. "This ride is also free." He looked back and gave her a rare, full smile. Not free, but paid in full by a good conversation. Helen opened the door, paused. At least let me buy you coffee next time. He raised a brow. Next time she surprised herself by nodding. Thursday. A beat, I'll be here. She closed the door, the rain tugging at the hem of her coat, and stepped inside her apartment lobby with something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Not hope, not yet, but maybe the space for it. Thursday came again, this time cloaked in the warmth of early spring. The rain had moved on, leaving Hopeville's streets rinsed and glistening. Helen Brooks stood outside her apartment building in a pale cardigan, clutching a used paperback. It was the kind of morning that felt like a second chance, though she wouldn't dare call it that out loud. True to his word, the black sedan pulled up at 9:00 a. Sharp. The man behind the wheel, Thomas Radcliffe, though she still only knew him as Tom, gave a subtle nod, as if their weekly routine had been years in the making. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She returned, sliding into the back seat. They didn't speak for the first few blocks. They rarely did at the beginning. There was a kind of sacred quiet in those early minutes, like tuning an old radio to the right frequency. "You always drive this route?" she asked, echoing her own words from last week. "I usually take the longer roads," he replied, his eyes steady on the road ahead. "Gives people more time to think, or talk, or not." Helen smiled faintly. "You ever get tired of listening?" He shrugged. "Listening is underrated." She let the silence stretch again, then held up the book in her hands. "The Remains of the Day," she said, showing the cover. "Ever read it?" He glanced at it briefly. "Once, a long time ago. But I remember the butler." Helen nodded. "Stevens. Always choosing duty over desire. Some people think that's noble. Some people mistake fear for nobility," she said, the words falling out before she could soften them. Tom glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Was that fear for him or for you? Helen didn't answer, not right away. She looked out the window, past the brick buildings, past the forgotten factories. When you take care of people your whole life, you forget what it's like to want something for yourself. Desire becomes inconvenient. And now, desire feels indulgent, like asking for dessert when you haven't finished your dinner. He didn't speak for a while. When he did, it was gentle. "I think we all deserve dessert. Eventually." Helen gave a soft laugh, but her eyes glistened. There was something about Tom that invited honesty, not in the pushy, prying way that others did, but with a stillness that said, "Say whatever you need. I won't flinch." "Did you always want to drive?" she asked. "No," he admitted. "It started as a distraction. Something simple, predictable. I'd spent years making decisions that affected thousands of people. I wanted a job where the only choice was left or right." "Sounds lonely." "It is," he said, "but not in the way you think. It's a clean kind of lonely." Helen studied him then, quietly. He was in his early 50s, she guessed. Lines at the corners of his eyes, not from frowning, but from looking too closely at things. He wore a gray button-down and a dark jacket, both well-made but unbranded. Nothing flashy. Everything chosen. He had the air of someone who'd walked away from a larger life and carried pieces of it in his silence. "Is it fair," she asked suddenly, "to hide parts of yourself from people just to be seen differently?" Tom considered that. Depends on the parts. Some things we hide because we're ashamed. Others, because we want to be loved for what's real. She felt that in her bones. She thought of all the times she had downplayed her education, her poetry, her solitude, afraid it made her less relatable, afraid it made her too much. They reached her usual drop-off point near a local community center. Before she opened the door, she paused. "You're not just a driver," she said quietly. Tom looked back. Expression unreadable. "No. And you're not going to tell me who you really are." Are you? A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "Not today." She stepped out onto the sidewalk. "Then I'll bring better questions next time." He smiled. "I'll bring better answers." The door shut with a soft click, but the echo of their exchange stayed with both of them long after. Inside the community center, Helen volunteered 2 mornings a week, helping seniors write letters, apply for benefits, or sometimes just talk. It wasn't paid, but it reminded her she still had value, still had a voice. But that day, her thoughts wandered more than usual. She kept thinking of the line he'd said, "Some things we hide because we want to be loved for what's real." The question that haunted her wasn't who Tom really was. It was why he seemed to see her so clearly, and whether she was brave enough to let herself be seen in return. It had been 3 days since their last conversation, but Helen Brooks was still replaying it in her mind, the way he had said, not today, not defensively, not evasively, just open-ended, like there might be a tomorrow when he'd tell her everything. That thought unnerved her more than she wanted to admit. She wasn't used to men like Tom Radcliffe, gentle without being weak, intelligent without needing to prove it, curious without invading. There was something unsettling in being seen so clearly, especially when she had spent so long trying not to be seen at all. Tuesday morning arrived with an unexpected stillness. The streets of Hopeville were unusually quiet for spring. No construction noise, no early morning chatter, just a kind of waiting. Helen had errands to run, library returns, a small grocery trip, and a walk she promised herself she'd take even if her knees ached. She didn't expect to see him. It wasn't Thursday, but as she stepped out of the produce store, arms full of paper bags and frustration at overpriced apples, a black sedan eased to the curb. The window rolled down. "You're early," Tom said, his mouth lifting at one corner. Helen blinked. "It's Tuesday." He nodded. "I was in the neighborhood." She squinted at him. "You don't strike me as someone who does anything by accident." "I'm not," he admitted. "I missed the conversation." She hesitated, one foot still on the sidewalk. Then, surprising herself, she said, "Give me 15 minutes. I'll make tea." His car sat parked outside her modest apartment building, like it didn't quite belong but also didn't care. Helen's place was quiet and lived in, filled with secondhand furniture and framed quotes from books she used to teach. A small lamp cast a warm glow in the corner. A single daffodil, slightly wilted, stood in a mason jar by the window. She poured the tea, unsure what this was, friendly, formal, strange. He accepted the cup with both hands, as though the ritual mattered. "This is a first," she said, sitting across from him at the small dining table. "I don't usually invite mysterious drivers into my home." Tom smiled. "And I don't usually get invited." They sat in silence for a few moments, sipping. "Why today?" Helen asked eventually. He didn't look at her. "Because I had a meeting that reminded me how far I've drifted from the version of myself I liked best." Helen tilted her head. And that version was the one who didn't need a title to feel worth something. That hung between them, like a question without a mark. "Who are you really?" "Tom," she asked, gently this time. He looked at her, really looked, and for a second, she saw something in his eyes, regret, fear, longing. "I'm someone who's spent the last 20 years living a life people admire, but never envied." That answer startled her. She thought of all the people she'd once admired, principals, administrators, public figures. How many of them carried emptiness beneath the performance? She spoke quietly. "I envy how still you are, like the chaos of the world can't reach you." He chuckled, but it was laced with something hollow. Stillness isn't always peace. Sometimes it's just exhaustion. Helen watched him for a long moment. Then, quietly, "You're safe here. You don't have to be anyone." He set down his cup. "That's why I came." A strange feeling washed over her, both familiarity and distance. Here was a man who saw her completely, yet remained partially behind a curtain of his own making. And she, long conditioned to give more than she received, didn't know how to reach through it without losing herself. "You know," she said, "I spent so long putting up walls that I forgot how to leave a door open." Tom nodded. "Same." The clock ticked on the wall. The tea grew cold, and neither moved. Finally, Helen stood. "I should get back to sorting the books," she said, half apologetically. He rose with her, "And I should get back to pretending I know what I'm doing." She opened the door for him, and he lingered on the threshold. "Thursday," he asked. She didn't answer with words, just a nod, one that said, "Yes. Come back, but bring more of yourself next time." As he stepped out onto the sidewalk, Helen leaned against the doorframe and watched him go. The street was familiar, but the feeling in her chest was not. Some days felt like rewinds, like life was a scratched record playing the same bar of music over and over again. For Helen Brooks, Tuesday bled into Thursday, and Thursday into another string of resumes sent into silence. The apartment remained unchanged, the scent of old paperbacks, the faint hum of a fridge that worked only when it felt generous, and the echo of her own inner monologue, repeating the same question, "Is this it?" But Thursdays, they were different now. It wasn't just the ride. It was the anticipation of it, the brief window where something real unexpected might happen. At 9:00 a.m. sharp, Tom Radcliffe's black sedan appeared at the curb like a well-timed verse in a poem. He didn't honk. He never did. Helen simply opened the door and settled into the silence that wasn't silence at all. "You look tired," he said gently, eyes flicking to hers in the rear view. "I've been arguing with algorithms all week," she replied. "Apparently, they think I'm irrelevant. Then they're poorly programmed." Helen gave a half smile. "Have you ever applied for something and felt disqualified before you even began?" "Yes," he said simply, "often." She studied his profile. "What did you do?" "I started showing up where I wasn't expected." Helen considered that. "Is that what you're doing now?" A pause. "Yes." The route they took today was longer, winding through a side of Hopeville she rarely saw anymore. Empty train stations, warehouses turned co-working spaces, cafes where nobody smiled, but everyone stared at screens. "You know," Helen said, "I miss slowness. People used to pause in conversations. Now it's all alerts and reactions." "I like slow," Tom said. "Things reveal themselves when you don't rush." She glanced out the window. "Do you think people can reinvent themselves after 40? I think it's the only time it's real." Helen raised an eyebrow. "Why's that?" "Because at 40, you're not chasing approval anymore. You're chasing peace." That answer settled somewhere deep in her. She turned to him. "What were you before this?" Tom's hands flexed on the steering wheel. "A builder, of bridges and other things. Systems, companies, expectations." Helen laughed quietly. "Expectations." "Mine," he said. "Everyone else's. I got very good at delivering what people wanted." And now he didn't answer immediately. "Then, now I'm learning to listen to what I want." She nodded slowly. "That's harder than it sounds." They stopped at a red light. Across the street, a mural stretched across a brick wall, an older woman with gray hair, arms wide, surrounded by paper cranes. Underneath, the words, "We bloom in our own seasons." Tom noticed her staring. "Beautiful. Isn't it?" Helen's voice was soft. "Do you ever wonder if you missed your season all the time?" he said. "But I'm starting to think seasons don't follow a clock." She smiled at that. When they pulled up near the library, she didn't move right away. "I don't want to sound dramatic," she began, "but these rides, they've been the most honest part of my week." Tom looked at her through the mirror. "That's not dramatic. That's rare." She bit her lip. "Do you always connect this easily with strangers?" "No," he said, "only with the ones who aren't really strangers." Helen blinked. "What does that mean?" Tom turned in his seat slightly. His voice was calm, but the weight behind it pressed against her ribs. "It means some people feel familiar long before you know their story." Helen felt her throat tighten. She opened the door, stepping out slowly. The day was bright, but the moment felt quiet again. "Next Thursday?" she asked. He gave her a gentle nod. Same time, same place. As he drove off, Helen watched the car until it turned the corner and disappeared. And for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen, and it scared her just enough to want more. The first time Helen Brooks invited Tom Radcliffe to coffee, it wasn't planned. It was raining again, Hopeville's favorite backdrop, and she didn't feel like being alone. They had just finished one of their usual drives, a route now familiar enough to have its own rhythm. The conversation that morning had been deeper than usual, brushing against regrets, missed moments, and the quiet ache of what-ifs. Tom had mentioned he liked coffee, real coffee, not the watered-down kind in gas stations or corporate kitchens. So Helen, on a whim that surprised even her, had said, "Well, I know a place that doesn't ruin the beans, and they have real mugs, not paper." Tom had raised an eyebrow but said nothing, just pulled the car into a side street without hesitation. That's how they found themselves in Maggie's Roast, a small cafe tucked between a dry cleaner and a second-hand bookstore. The lighting was low, the furniture unmatched, and the staff permanently in flannel. It was Helen's kind of place. She had come here for years, alone mostly, to grade papers or write in her journal, or simply sit. Tom took his coffee black. No sugar, no milk, just as she suspected. "Do you come here often?" he asked, taking in the dusty bookshelves and old jazz playing from a speaker in the corner. "I used to," Helen replied, "before the world got too loud." They sat by the window. Outside, the rain tapped against the glass in soft rhythms. Inside, something unspoken stretched between them, not tension. Exactly. More like recognition. "Do you ever miss your old life?" Helen asked. Tom leaned back in his chair. "Some parts. Not the pressure, not the noise, but I miss building things. Bridges." He shook his head slightly. Moments, places that made people feel like they belonged. Helen stirred her coffee slowly. "You talk like someone who's lost something." "I have," he said. "But I also let go of things I never needed to hold, like what he looked down at the mug. Ego, reputation, that constant chase to prove my value." She nodded. "And did it work letting go most days?" He said, Some days, I still feel like I'm auditioning for a role I didn't choose." Helen leaned forward. "You and me both." They shared a small smile, then silence, then more coffee. That became their ritual. Every Thursday morning, Tom picked her up. Sometimes the route changed, sometimes it didn't. But what never changed was the quiet space they gave each other, the absence of performance. And once or twice a week, usually on rainy days, they'd find themselves back at Maggie's Roast. One evening, they stayed until closing. Tom had asked, "What was your favorite thing about teaching?" Helen answered without hesitation. Seeing a student find their voice, watching them write something they didn't know was inside them. He had looked at her for a long moment. "Maybe that's what you're still doing." She blinked. "Teaching." He nodded. "Me." The air shifted after that. It wasn't romance. Not yet. It was something quieter, older, and perhaps deeper trust. One Thursday evening, Helen brought an old leather-bound notebook with her. "What's this?" Tom asked, gently touching its worn spine. "My life in fragments," she said. "I write when the world's too much, or when I'm too much. May I read something?" She hesitated, then flipped to a short passage. "Loneliness isn't always being alone. Sometimes it's being with people who never ask you questions that matter." Tom read it twice, maybe 3 times. "That's not just writing," he said. "That's truth." She felt something soften inside her. "Then I suppose that makes you a rare audience." He didn't respond right away, but when he did, it wasn't with words. He simply reached across the table and gently tapped her notebook. "Write more. There's someone who wants to keep reading." Helen didn't sleep much that night, not because of anxiety, not because of the job search, but because, for the first time in years, someone saw her not as a failed teacher or a middle-aged woman or a burden, but as a storyteller, a builder, a bridge. She wasn't sure what Tom Radcliffe was hiding behind those quiet eyes, but she knew one thing. He had become the most unexpected chapter of her life, and maybe, just maybe, the most meaningful. Helen Brooks had always believed that truth had a texture. You could feel it sometimes soft, sometimes sharp, but always distinct. And that afternoon, when she opened her laptop to search for a grant program she'd heard about at the community center, the truth came at her not gently, but like shattered glass under bare feet. She hadn't meant to search for him. It started with a curiosity. She typed in Radcliffe Construction, a name Tom had offhandedly mentioned one rainy morning when describing the bridges he used to help design. She expected an article about blueprints or municipal bids. What she found was something else entirely. Thomas Radcliffe, CEO of Radcliffe Global. The headline read. Below it, a crisp photo, a man in a tailored navy suit standing in front of a podium, mid-speech, strong jaw, calm eyes, hair swept back. It was unmistakably him, Tom, her driver. The article went on Harvard-educated, inherited his father's construction empire after a sudden illness, rebranded the company to focus on sustainable infrastructure, Forbes Visionary of the Year 3 years ago. Helen sat frozen, staring at the screen. The same man who rode around Hopeville's side streets in a black sedan, who drank bitter coffee with her in a mismatched mug, who told her he had built things and walked away from them. He hadn't walked away. He had just put on another mask. That night, Helen didn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, emotions twisting into each other: confusion, betrayal, embarrassment, even shame. She felt foolish, played, like a character in a movie who should have known better. Why hadn't he told her? Why had he let her share her life, her truths, while holding back his own? By morning, the rain returned, as if summoned by the mood in her chest. At exactly 9:00 a.m., Tom's car arrived, right on cue, but Helen didn't get in. Instead, she stepped to the edge of the curb, umbrella tucked under one arm, and motioned for him to roll the window down. He did. "What's wrong?" he asked, sensing the shift. She held up her phone, screen still lit with the article. "You should have told me." Tom's eyes dropped to the screen, then back to her. "I know. That's it. You know I wanted you to know me, Helen, not the version the world curated." She shook her head. "That's not how trust works. You don't get to decide which truths matter." There was pain in his eyes, but not surprise, as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. "May I explain?" She crossed her arms. "I think you've explained enough to magazines, to investors, to whoever else gets the real name." "I didn't lie," he said softly. "I just delayed the truth. That's called omission." He opened his mouth, then closed it. Helen turned to leave, her steps slow but firm. Before she reached the door, he called after her. "I was going to tell you. I just didn't want it to end everything." She paused, but didn't turn back. "Then maybe you should have started with the truth, and trusted that it wouldn't." The car stayed parked for several minutes after she went inside, but she never looked back. That afternoon, Helen didn't go to the community center. She didn't write in her journal. She didn't open her laptop again. She made tea, but forgot to drink it. The apartment felt smaller than ever. Her bookshelves, once comforting, now stared at her like mute witnesses. She'd spent so long craving authenticity, and now, in its absence, every room echoed with the question, was any of it real? And somewhere deep inside, another question lingered. Why does this hurt more than it should? 2 days had passed since Helen Brooks shut the door on Tom Radcliffe. Not with anger, but with a kind of quiet devastation that felt far worse. She wasn't sure what stung more, the revelation of who he truly was, or the confirmation that trust, once broken, didn't shatter like glass. It cracked like bone, deep, quiet, and slow to heal. She'd tried to distract herself, cooked meals she didn't eat, reread old letters from students, folded laundry that didn't need folding, but every corner of her apartment reminded her of conversations, laughter, shared silences, and lies. Then came the knock at her door. It wasn't forceful, just steady, measured. She opened it, expecting a neighbor, maybe the delivery guy who sometimes forgot which apartment was which. But instead, standing under the overcast sky, in a coat too formal for the block, was a woman with the same calm poise as Tom, but colder. "Ms. Brooks," the woman asked. Her voice was warm silk with a steel lining. Helen nodded slowly. Yes, I'm Lauren Radcliffe, Thomas's sister. The name hit like a second betrayal, somehow colder than the first. Lauren extended a gloved hand. May I come in? Helen didn't respond right away, but something told her it wouldn't matter. This woman wasn't used to hearing no. Inside. Lauren walked like someone who had judged every chair in the room before choosing to sit on the one she could most easily control. I'll be brief, she said, setting down a monogrammed clutch. My brother tends to lose perspective when he forgets who he is. Helen stood. She wasn't about to sit across from someone who already viewed her as beneath. I know exactly who your brother is, she replied calmly. Now. Lauren's smile tightened. Then you understand the importance of keeping certain relationships appropriate. The air between them turned to ice. I didn't realize coffee and conversation were a breach of class structure, Helen said, voice low. Lauren's gaze sharpened. Spare me the theatrics. You're a woman of modest means. He's the CEO of a global company. That difference matters. To you, Helen said, not to him. Are you so sure? Lauren leaned in slightly. Because from where I sit, this, she gestured vaguely, has all the markings of a distraction, and he cannot afford distractions, not with the merger underway. Helen's heart clenched. A merger, Tom had never mentioned it. Why are you here, Ms. Radcliffe? Because Thomas listens to people who see him as human, and I need you to stop being one of those people. There it was, the fracture drawn in sharp lines, not just between Helen and Tom, but between Helen and the entire world he came from. I don't want anything from him, Helen said, steady despite her pulse. I never have. Lauren stood. Good. Then this should be easy for you. She pulled a white envelope from her clutch and placed it on the coffee table like it was poisoned. There's a check inside. Consider it a thank you for stepping away. Helen stared at the envelope, a silence so thick it felt like screaming filled the room. She picked it up, not to keep it, but to tear it in two. No amount of money could pay for what he gave me. Lauren's eyes narrowed, and what was that? Helen met her gaze, a sense of being seen, which I suspect is something neither of you understand. With that, she opened the door. Lauren paused at the threshold. You'll regret this. Not today, but eventually. Helen smiled faintly. I've lived a life that most people would pity. I've had nothing and kept my dignity. I've faced grief, rejection, and silence. But the one thing I've never regretted is choosing the truth over convenience. The door closed with a click that felt like a small, personal triumph. But the silence afterward was louder than ever. That evening, Helen walked the long route to clear her thoughts. The streets of Hopeville, usually familiar, felt blurred like the landscape of a dream, fading on waking. She found herself, almost unconsciously, outside Maggie's roast. She didn't go in. She couldn't. Instead, she sat on the bench nearby, the one under the flickering lamppost, and looked out at the road, and waited. For what? She wasn't sure, until headlights slowed, until the black sedan rolled to a stop, and until a familiar voice, weary but steady, said from the window, I didn't send her. Helen didn't move. Then you should have stopped her, she said quietly. Tom stepped out of the car. His coat was unbuttoned, his hair slightly disheveled. He looked nothing like the CEO in the articles. He looked like the man who once told her bridges could be built anywhere. I'm sorry, he said, for what she asked, lying, hiding. Letting someone speak for you, for making you doubt yourself, he said, for not trusting that you'd see all of me. And stay. Helen's heart twisted, and for a long moment, she didn't know whether to forgive him or let him go. Because love, real love, wasn't always about romance. Sometimes it was about choosing truth, even when it hurt. Helen Brooks had always thought of truth as something noble, simple, honest, like opening a window after a long winter. But that was before the truth became a battlefield. After Lauren Radcliffe's visit and Tom's quiet apology by the curb, Helen found herself more conflicted than ever. The man she trusted had deceived her. Yes, but the way he stood in the rain, vulnerable, without the armor of status, spoke to a deeper sincerity. She didn't know what to do with that. So she did what she always did when life overwhelmed her. She wrote. Pages filled her notebook lines raw, unpolished. Thoughts like, why does the lie hurt more than the truth behind it? Why do I miss him and resent him at the same time? And why does the idea of being loved by someone like him feel more terrifying than being alone? 2 mornings later, a letter arrived, not an email, not a message, but a real, handwritten envelope. The return address simply read, T. Radcliffe. Inside. The letter wasn't long, but it was honest, and that made it harder to ignore. Helen, I've built companies, led mergers, negotiated with heads of state, but nothing scared me like our conversations. Not because of what you might discover about me, but because of what I was discovering about myself. I've lived in a world where masks are currency, and with you, for the first time, I didn't want one. I won't ask you to forgive me. I only ask that you believe this. The man you've come to know is real, more real than the title beside my name. Helen sat with the letter in her lap, the ink smudged faintly in one corner. He had written it by hand. That mattered, but still, she needed more. That afternoon, she went to the community center early, but instead of helping with letters or filling out forms, she asked for the quiet room in the back, the one reserved for private conversations and grief counseling. She brought her notebook, and her anger, and her hope. And when Tom walked through the door at 3:15, holding nothing but a thermos of coffee and that familiar, cautious expression, she didn't speak right away. He sat down. They stared at each other in silence. Finally, she said, "Why me?" His brow furrowed. "What do you mean you could have confided in anyone? Women in your world wear silk and sit on boards. I drink discount coffee and wear hand-me-down sweaters. So why me?" Tom's voice was low. "Because you didn't need anything from me. That's not enough." He nodded. "Then because you asked better questions. Because you listened without trying to fix me. Because when I was with you, I didn't feel like I had to perform." Helen swallowed. Her voice cracked. "And yet you were performing the whole time." Tom looked down. "I was surviving." "There's a difference." She let that settle. "I didn't lie to hurt you," he said. "I lied because I was afraid that if you knew the full truth, it would change how you saw me." "It did," she whispered, "but not in the way you think." He looked up. Helen stood and walked to the window. Outside, children played in the fenced-in lot behind the center, kicking a deflated soccer ball with the kind of joy only simplicity can offer. "I saw you as someone human," she continued, "but now I also see the world you come from, and it scares me, because people like me don't belong in that world." "You don't have to belong in it," Tom said. "That's not the world I want to live in anymore." She turned to him. "But it is your world, Tom, and no matter how many cups of coffee we share, I'll never be part of it." He stood then. "Maybe I don't want to be part of it either. Maybe it's time I build something different, something that feels like this." Helen stared at him. She wanted to believe it. More than anything, she wanted to believe it, but belief wasn't enough. "Not yet. I need time," she said. Tom nodded. "Take all the time you need." And then he left, not with the finality of a slammed door, but with the quiet of someone willing to wait outside it. That night, Helen stood at her window, holding his letter again, and she whispered, not to him, but to herself, "What if this is the beginning of my season?" The bookstore smelled like rain-soaked paper and dust, the kind of scent that slowed time. Helen Brooks hadn't planned on returning to Galloway Books, not today, but her feet had led her there, like they remembered something her mind hadn't caught up to. It was a place she used to visit often when her mother was still alive. They would browse old cookbooks and poetry collections, sometimes not even buying anything, just soaking in the quiet, the weight of stories pressed between faded spines. Today, the bell above the door tinkled gently as she entered. "Miss Brooks," came a familiar voice from behind a leaning stack of books, back from the land of invisibility. She smiled. Ben Galloway, the store's owner, emerged with a pencil behind his ear and a cardigan older than Helen's college degree. His gray beard looked even more wild than usual. Felt like I needed to breathe among paper. Helen said. A sound choice, Ben replied, motioning to the back corner. I just got a new box of used classics, some Whitman, a Bronte or two. She made her way through the narrow aisles, her fingertips grazing the cracked covers as if in conversation. Then the bell rang again. Helen didn't turn around at first, but the air changed, a quiet caught in her breath. Tom. She turned, and there he was, holding a book instead of a coffee, dressed simply, no jacket, no mask. I wasn't sure you'd come, she said, heart tight in her chest. I wasn't sure you'd want me to, he replied. Ben, sensing the shift, gave a small wink and vanished into the back room. Tom stepped closer. I talked to my board this morning. Helen blinked. About the merger. He nodded. I told them I'm stepping down. She stared at him. You what? They didn't take it well. My sister threatened to sue. The lawyers mumbled things about fiduciary duty. But I've made my decision. Helen could barely process it. Why Tom's eyes never wavered. Because I was building something that didn't look like the future I wanted. I want to build something that feels like us. Something real. She shook her head slowly, still stunned. You're giving it all up. No, he said quietly. I'm trading it in. For what? For a life that doesn't make me question who I am every time I speak. They stood there, surrounded by the silent witness of stories, the air thick with choices. I've been thinking about this place, Tom said, glancing around the shelves, and about what it would mean to make it more than a bookstore, a community space, a place for people to be heard, maybe even write their own stories. Helen frowned slightly. Ben would never sell? Tom smiled. He already agreed. When I asked him if he'd consider retiring, he said yes, if you agreed to run it with me. Helen blinked. With you, Tom nodded. You have the soul of a storyteller. I have the background in structure and logistics. Together, we could build something beautiful. She stepped back. Tom, I don't know the first thing about running a business, and I didn't know the first thing about being vulnerable, he said, but you taught me that. The silence returned. This time, not empty, but full of possibilities. Ben reappeared, holding 2 mugs of tea and a knowing grin. So, are you two planning to buy this old ship and set sail? Helen looked at Tom, then at the store, then at her own hands, weathered, capable, still steady. I don't know what this is, she said, but I know it feels honest. And I know I'm tired of waiting for a life that fits someone else's mold. Tom extended his hand. Then let's build one of our own. She took it, not with certainty, but with trust. And maybe that was enough. The morning light spilled across the windows of Galloway Books, now reborn as the listening room. The faded sign had been replaced with warm, hand-painted lettering. Inside, old shelves had been polished, rearranged into welcoming nooks. Mismatched chairs surrounded low tables, each adorned with local poetry, community journals, and hand-bound notebooks labeled Your Story Matters. The old cafe counter now held pastries from a neighborhood baker and coffee brewed strong, not corporate. There was no Wi-Fi on purpose. A small sign by the door read, Here, we talk, we write, we listen. Helen Brooks stood behind the counter, straightening a stack of blank journals. She wore a long cardigan and soft linen scarf, her gray-streaked hair tucked behind one ear. The bell above the door jingled as the first customer walked in. First pot's hot, she said with a smile. Take a cup, take a seat. People trickled in slowly at first, neighbors, students, elders from the center. Some recognized the place, others were drawn by curiosity. And then, just past 10 o'clock, Tom Radcliffe appeared. He wasn't in a suit. He hadn't worn one since he turned in his resignation. Today he wore a white button-down rolled at the sleeves, dark jeans, and a look that was both focused and quietly content. He stepped behind the counter and gave Helen a look, Ready, terrified. She replied. Perfect. He smiled. So am I. They poured coffee. They handed out free bookmarks that read, "Everyone has a chapter they don't read out loud." By noon, the shop was filled not just with customers, but with conversation. One corner hosted a local artist showing sketches of life on the street. Another had a teenager nervously reading a poem from a yellow notebook. The back corner had an old man retelling stories of his time in the Navy. This wasn't a business, it was a movement. At 12:43 p.m., the bell above the door rang again. Helen turned and froze. Lauren Radcliffe stood in the entry, perfectly dressed, her heels too elegant for the weathered floors. Her expression unreadable. Tom noticed too. He set down the kettle slowly. "Lauren," he said, walking toward her. "I didn't come for a fight," she said, eyes scanning the space. "Then why are you here?" Tom asked, cautious but calm. Lauren paused. Her voice was lower now. "Because I didn't believe you when you said you were serious. About all this. About walking away." And now Lauren looked at the space, the people, the chalkboard that read, "This week's question. What truth have you stopped hiding?" She met his eyes. "Now I see that you've already walked too far to turn back." Tom said nothing. Lauren's gaze shifted to Helen, who had quietly stepped forward. "You must be Ms. Brooks," she said. Helen nodded. "Welcome." Lauren studied her. "You left an empire for—" This Tom answered before Helen could. "I didn't leave anything. I chose something." Lauren turned to go, then paused. "Father would have said you're wasting your potential." "No," Tom said. "Steady now." He'd have said I finally remembered it. Lauren didn't respond, but as she stepped outside, Helen noticed her pace had slowed, and her shoulders had dropped ever so slightly. Maybe that was all the apology she'd ever get. Maybe that was enough. By 3:00 p.m. The listening room was filled with stories. A former factory worker shared how he'd lost everything in the 2008 crash. A young mother admitted she hadn't written since high school. A widow read a letter she wrote to herself on the day her husband died. Helen listened. She didn't try to fix or compare or interrupt. She just listened. At the end of the day, Tom joined her by the window, watching the sky blush into evening. "We did it," he said. She leaned into him. "No. We're doing it." He reached for her hand. They sat in silence, but it wasn't empty. It was full of stories, of risk, of everything that had once seemed impossible, and maybe of love, too. Spring settled over Hopeville like a gentle exhale. The dogwoods outside the listening room bloomed in defiant color, white and pink against the city's gray shoulders. Helen Brooks stood on the sidewalk, chalk in hand, updating the quote board outside the door. Today's message read, "Sometimes the wrong road takes you exactly where you were meant to be." She stepped back to admire it when she heard the low rumble of an engine she knew by heart. The black sedan, Tom's old ride. It had been months since he last drove it, since they launched the bookstore cafe. He hadn't needed it. But today, something about the sound of it rolling down the street made Helen's breath catch. Tom pulled up to the curb, rolled down the window, and smiled. "Need a ride?" Helen crossed her arms, a smirk tugging at her lips. "Are you stalking me again?" "Radcliffe." "Only if it leads to something good," he said. "Hop in." She climbed into the passenger seat, laughing. "This feels backward." "It's always been backward," Tom replied, easing the car into traffic. "But maybe backward is what we needed." They drove through the familiar streets of Hopeville, past Maggie's Roast, past the old community center, past places that once held weight, but now simply lived inside them like well-worn pages. "I almost didn't pick you up that day," Tom admitted. Helen looked at him. "What changed your mind?" He glanced at her briefly. "You looked like someone who deserved to be heard." She rested her hand on the window frame. "Funny. I think I've spent most of my life trying not to be noticed." Tom nodded. "You were hiding." "I was hiding. Maybe we only found each other because of that." They drove in silence for a while, no need to fill the spaces. Then Helen said quietly, "Do you regret it? Leaving the company? Starting over?" Tom turned to her, smile soft but unwavering. Do you? She looked out the window, at the trees blooming where winter once lingered. No, she said, not for a second. That afternoon, they returned to the listening room, where Ben Galloway had stopped by with fresh scones and a new poem handwritten in his notebook. A group of high school students gathered in the back for their first writing circle. A war veteran and a local barista were deep in conversation over black coffee. This wasn't just a business. It was a bridge between past and future, between people who had never felt seen and those finally ready to look closer. Before closing, Helen sat at the writing table near the window and opened her leather-bound notebook, the same one she carried that rainy day so long ago. She wrote, "We spend so much of life waiting for the right time, the right job, the right person. But sometimes, what saves us isn't right at all. It's unexpected, unscripted, like a black car pulling to the curb when we thought no one was coming." That's the thing about stories. They don't always start at the beginning. Sometimes they start where you were supposed to give up. And sometimes the best chapters begin when you finally let yourself be known. She paused, then underlined the last sentence, twice. Tom stepped behind her, reading over her shoulder. "That's the best thing you've ever written," he whispered. She closed the journal, leaned back in her chair, and looked up at him. "I think it's the truest." That night, as they locked up and turned off the lights, Helen paused at the front window. "I never asked," she said. "Why you kept the car?" Tom glanced at the black sedan, parked neatly along the curb. "It reminds me where I started," he said, "and who I want to keep becoming." Helen nodded. "I like that." They stepped outside into the warm spring night. The street was quiet. The city exhaled. Tom reached for her hand, and together, they walked away not toward an ending, but into a life they had rewritten from the wrong turn. That turned out to be exactly right. Sometimes, the most powerful journeys don't begin with a map. They begin with a moment of kindness, a wrong turn, a choice to see someone beyond their title, their paycheck, or the zip code they come from. Helen and Tom's story isn't just about love. It's about daring to cross the invisible lines society draws between us. Lines that say, "You don't belong here." Lines that whisper, "You're not enough." But the truth is, we are all more than where we started. Their story is a quiet rebellion against judgment, against expectation, against a world that tells us who we're supposed to be before we ever get the chance to show who we really are. And maybe, just maybe, that rebellion starts with listening. If this story touched something in you, your heart, your past, your sense of worth, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, not just to support us, but because someone else out there might need to hear this too. We believe every story matters, and we can't wait to bring you the next one. Until then, be kind, be seen, and never let the world decide your worth.